Hi, welcome to the Behind the Balance Sheet podcast, where we meet leading investors and commentators and educate ourselves about the world of investing and the world. Our mission is to remove some of the mystique around investing and improve our understanding of what makes a successful investment, or indeed an unsuccessful one. Our goal is to inform, educate, and entertain. We hope you enjoy this and every episode.
Behind the Balance Sheet and affiliates and podcast guests may own shares or have an economic interest in securities discussed in this podcast, which is aired for your education and entertainment only. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or relied upon for investment decisions. Always do your own research.
Dan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on. I wanted to start with your career, and you started at Citigroup in the research department. Is that right? I mean, how did you then end up being the man that exposed Wirecard?
Steve, yeah, thanks for having me on. God, that's a long time ago, isn't it? I started in Citi on the grad program, sort of just working between research and the sales floor. And I basically write summaries of what the researchers had written. Take this big report and condense it down so the sales guy could get on the phone with the client and just read that. And, you know, it was fascinating. Like, stock markets are fascinating. I learned a huge amount about companies. I learned a little bit about, you know, how accounting works, not very much. But I sort of reached a point where I looked around the room and I didn't see anybody who I wanted to be. And there'd been this nagging voice at the back of my head, you know, didn't you want to be a journalist? So I kind of decided I would quit before, you know, markets crashed and there were lots more intelligent and educated people going for those sorts of jobs. And tried my hand at being a reporter.
And so what, you just applied to the FT and they said, oh, you've been in the city. We normally get it the other way around, right? One of your colleagues has just moved from Alphaville to a hedge fund, right?
Oh yeah, Jamie has just gone in the opposite direction, hasn't he? Which, I mean, good luck to him. It'll be really interesting to hear how that is. I was very lucky in that I managed to get a job on the Investors Chronicle, which is a great share tipping magazine.
It's a fantastic magazine. You should all go out and buy it. I also write for the...
Oh, of course. Oh, brilliant. I didn't realise that. You know, very loyal subscriber base. And I was basically doing the same job as before, learning a little bit about journalism. And the lucky thing was it was owned by the same company, Pearson, which owned the FT at the time, and I could see the internal job ads. So I sort of lucked into a job on Lex, you know, writing opinion for the back page of the FT. And, you know, I was terrified. Every day I sort of kept expecting to be tapped on the shoulder and someone go, yeah, we've just realised that you're here. How on earth did this happen?
The Lex column is really challenging, right? Because it's very highly authoritative commentary, and some amazing journalists been through there. I mean, Dominic Lawson, Lucy Galloway, and Stuart Kirk, who has recently
the
been
Stuart Kirk.
The famous
yes,
Stuart Kirk.
I worked with Stuart for a long time.
So in your biography, you talk about other frauds before Wirecard. We will get to Wirecard, but I'm just curious because one or two of those, Quindell, Fully, these were, fairly obvious frauds, right? And they just carried on.
Well, let's just say on Quindell, the Serious Fraud Office investigated for many years and then closed its investigation, and no one's convicted, just in case anyone's wondering. But yes, it certainly, there was enough grounds there to suspect a lot of fraud, right?
Well, I should correct myself. They looked like frauds.
It definitely had accounting problems.
Yeah, and there were definitely accounting issues, yeah.
And yeah, so writing about these sorts of things was this incredible education in how those sorts of businesses work. And what happened was Quindell was attacked by some short sellers in 2014. And I started to get interested after that, sort of saying, hey, what's going on here? Let's try and understand the business. And it was basically a tech gobbledygook press release machine. So it was something to do with insurance, but it turned out they were basically a listed law firm, which is really unusual. And there were only two of them. Slater and Gordon was another one in Australia. And both of them had major accounting problems and basically collapsed. And the thing about Quindell was it had this rabid band of investors who had made a lot of money buying it retail. And whenever I wrote anything about Quindell, they would all appear in the comments. And it became this sort of thing that the other readers would show up for because it was so funny, because you would have these guys sort of go, "You don't know what you're talking about. This is a great British company. Why are you bashing it? Do your work, McCrum," all of that sort of stuff.
Presumably now you don't get that sort of pushback, or did you get quite a lot of that sort of pushback with Wirecard?
I mean, the pushback from Wirecard was like Quindell on steroids, with some friends in the security services. I mean, the thing about Wirecard, and this is why I felt I just had to write the book, was as a journalist, you're not supposed to become the story, right? And with Wirecard, that kind of just happened. It took over my life and turned it upside down. And the deeper I dug into this company, which started out as, it's this curious little German payments company. And the more I looked into it, it was like, there seem to be hackers involved, private detectives, and they've got some very angry lawyers. And then there are these bizarre moments where, my editor, Paul Murphy, who worked with me on the whole thing, pulls me aside and he goes, "Yeah, Dan, the chief operating officer of this Wirecard company. So he's been flashing around some documents to speculators in London, and they've got the recipe for the nerve gas Novichok on them. I think he's got some sort of Russian connection." And at that point, you're just going, what is happening in the world?
I mean, this was the amazing thing. I mean, I really enjoyed the book, and well done for writing it.
Oh, thank you.
But it was almost like, if it had been a work of fiction, it wouldn't have been credible, because some of this stuff, you talk about a meeting between Nick Gold, a football agent, and a representative of a Far Eastern investor, and it just, if that meeting had taken place in a work of fiction, you're going, well, no, of course that couldn't happen. Why is it so fantastic? I mean, was it just a work of Marsalek's imagination that he was a mad guy? I
think you've hinted at some of this here. It just sort of, it's like this cat and mouse game. Sort of, we go backwards and forwards, and each step just becomes crazier and more unbelievable than the next. And you're literally pinching yourself saying, this can't be real. And so the main bad guy you mentioned, Jan Marsalek, fascinating character, this Austrian whiz kid. So he drops out of high school in Vienna, speaks multiple languages, and he goes to work for a tech startup. It's the late 90s, everyone's doing that. And he gets poached to join Wirecard. But it turns out he's not quite as whizzy as people think. And he almost destroys the company because he's working on this big project, but it doesn't work out. But by that point, he's the only one who understands it, so he's too important to fire. And this sort of pattern repeats. He constantly takes the company to the brink of disaster, but somehow comes up with a way of getting out of it. He's this sort of he's so charming. Everyone talks about, he could talk for hours and you'd be completely fascinated. And he loves, fancy dinners. He wears, the most expensive bespoke shirts, not just bespoke suits. And he's stylish. Everyone who encounters him, they all start to try and dress like him as well. He sort of, wraps people up in his orbit. But then there's this other side to him, which is, either he is a spy, or he's got a bit of a James Bond fixation, and he likes hanging out with spies. So there's one example where he never goes on holiday. Like, he tries to go on holiday. He's got this long-suffering partner who occasionally he takes to, fabulous spas, things like that. But whenever they try and go on holiday, 2 days later he's back at work. Complete workaholic. So his friends, who include this Russian mercenary, say to him, okay, what do you want to do for a break? And he says, I want to do something which no one else in the world can. So the Russian guy says, well, how about, do you want to come and take a walk around Palmyra in Syria, where the Russian mercenaries have just conquered from ISIS? He's like, sure, yeah. So he does, and he had this like base of operations, this mini palace in Munich, and there was a little chunk of sort of, rubble from a Palmyra statue or something, which he picked up on this little sightseeing jaunt.
So did you meet Marsalek?
No, I never met Mark. It's this incredible thing where, it's a strange life when you genuinely have an adversary.
Yes.
And I try and bring that across. I knew that he was the bad guy, and we had to try and expose him. And there's all these, I'm trying to work out what's happening inside the company. What is the fraud that's going on? And he's always at the fringes. People refer to him. They're like, oh, that's one of Marsalek's companies, as if that explains things. And so I could never quite put him in the frame. But yeah, I never actually met him. The only time there was a meeting was when my editor, Paul Murphy, he had a couple of lunches with him, which started out, the premise being there was a bribe on the table. $10 million to make the Financial Times stories go away.
Now, for those of you who are listening to the podcast and not watching a video clip, I should point out that Dan is not wearing a designer shirt. And $10 million, that's quite tempting. So what is it that allows you to rise above all of this and pursue an adversary in such a dogged fashion? Because most people would have given up. Why did you? Was it just it got in your blood and you had to pursue it?
Journalist brains maybe work a little bit differently. There's this great book, Bill Buffett, Among the Thugs. It's all about hooliganism in the 80s. And he goes and spends a load of time with Manchester United fans who go on these rampages around Europe. And he describes this moment where the Italian riot police charge them, and he finds himself underneath a car being battered with batons. And he says part of his brain is going, oh my God, what is happening to me? Yikes, gotta stop, getting a head injury. And then the journalist part of his brain is going, wow, this is an amazing story, isn't it? How am I gonna write this and tell everyone about it? So there's that aspect to it. It was this puzzle.
Yes.
Like, I knew it was this great story, because I started out, when was it? God, it's 8 years ago that I first started looking at this.
So it started, you were tipped off by John Hempton.
Yes, John Hempton, the Aussie hedge fund manager.
So John is an amazing analyst. He's probably one of the smartest people around in hedge funds, and particularly at sniffing at fraud. So what happened? He tipped you off, and then how does it start? So John Hempton says, "Oh, you want to take a look at Wirecard." How does it? What do you do? How'd you get started?
Well, what he actually said to me was, "Would you be interested in some German gangsters?" And I think at the time I just jotted the name down. Wirecard. I had a look at it, and I was like, "I can't make head nor tail of this." That was one of the tricks you use if you're a fraud. You make your business very complicated, and if anyone questions it, you just say, you don't understand it. And so then it was a couple of months later, and actually because of Quindell, this British hedge fund manager called Leo Perry, really smart. He actually, it turns out, had a bit of a hand in some of the information which was put out there on Quindell. He'd seen my work on that, and he got in touch. The phrase in journalism is stories get stories.
Right.
So he calls me up and says, can we go for a coffee? And we meet in the Cafe Nero by Mansion House. Sit down, and he sort of brings out these closely typed notes. And it's basically his theory of what's going on inside Wirecard. And to sort of summarize it very simply, it had spent 5 years buying up lots of weird little companies all over Asia. And when he looked at the details, nothing matched what Wirecard was saying about these deals. And businesses looked in bad shape. They weren't worth nearly as much as Wirecard said. There were all sorts of problems with them. And I was like, aha, maybe there's something going on here. And that's what set me to work.
And to start with, I mean, Wirecard was doing okay, processing sort of semi-legal payments for porn sites and gambling sites, and then they started to experience more competition as their former COO moved to an Israeli company where he pursued their poker customers. So that was when they needed to turn to fraud to engineer the continued growth. Is that?
I think that's the moment. So the potted history of Wirecard is this German trainer distributor who's an entrepreneur, looks a bit like an aging rock star. He has a conversation with someone who works for Larry Flint on a plane, ends up starting a porn business, has to take payments for it. That leads him to start a payments business, which becomes Wirecard. And they sort of double down, becomes this great business. But there's this moment when, the world is changing. Processing payments for gambling is a lot harder than it used to be. The US makes it illegal. All that porn stuff is going away because free porn. And at that moment, the Vans distributor, the aging rock star guy, he doesn't like the look of the business anymore, and he leaves. And he also, his friend, who is effectively running the whole thing, leaves and takes some of Wirecard's best poker clients with him. So you kind of have this moment when Wirecard is in crisis. There's a whole other thing with, the dark lord of the internet, but that's too much detail to get into today. And I think that is the moment when Wirecard can't grow like it used to anymore, and that's when they have to start cooking the books.
And that led you to interview Marcus Braun. Tell us about that.
Okay, so Marcus Braun is a funny character. And normally, if you're the Financial Times, you knock on the door of a startup, they're like, yeah, let's tell you about our great business. And they were different. And this was one of the first red flags. They were like, oh no, we can't talk to you, we're too busy with results. Come to Munich and we'll have some junior product manager, tell you about our exciting business. And then when I send them a bunch of detailed questions, all about, little points about their accounting, they came back with an email which effectively said, this is very suspicious. These questions are very similar to those we've been asked by a short seller. Are you in league with them? Are you naively being used by them? And that was like, ooh, I think we've hit a nerve here. And so this leads to my one and only interview with Wirecard's chief executive, Marcus Braun. And he's a very cold character. Like all the staff say it, he's very aloof, very proud. And he doesn't seem to have managed the business on a day-to-day basis. He's much more a figurehead who would deal with sort of the outside analysts. But he doesn't travel. Like the rumor was that he was afraid of flying. And he would just sort of sit in his office, checking the share price on his phone, sipping peppermint tea. And he didn't do many interviews. And when I spoke to him, I sort of realized why, because he's like a former management consultant. And it was all sort of blue sky jargon, all that stuff about, oh, we're just like Apple, but then he'll, with 3 sentences of dense technical blah. And that went on for quite some time. And you're like, okay, I'm only dimly aware what you're talking about. It's something to do with payments. But then we get to the point where I'm like, okay, effectively, so here's everything I've looked at. These funny companies you're buying in Asia. Looks like you're hiding something, aren't you? Are you faking your profits? And what I always find strange is, he did say, yeah, that's bullshit. But he used a couple of tactics which are sort of notable. So he asked a question instead of answering it. Why would I do this? He didn't deny it, he sort of referred to outside authority. Why are all these analysts love us? We have a very prestigious accounting firm, Ernst & Young, auditing our figures. You know, I'm Wirecard's biggest shareholder. And the tone of it was strange as well. Like he was, oh gosh, yes, someone's asked me if I'm a fraudster again. Oh, I get this all the time. Let me explain to you why everything's above board. Instead of, you know, if I said to you, Steve, are you stealing all this money? You'd get angry. You'd be like, what are you talking about? No, I've never stolen anything.
It's funny because this is a standard, I mean, these are, everything you said are standard techniques of people who are trying to obfuscate.
Yes.
And, you know, obviously, if you're working at a hedge fund, you learn, either get trained or learn how to understand, you know, if people are telling the truth or not. And, you know, I've been doing that job for a long time. And, you know, assessing management can be quite tricky. But knowing that somebody's honest is actually more straightforward. And I've had instances where people have tried to obfuscate and I've jumped to the wrong conclusion because I think, well, there's something wrong here. But why is it that when you get a character like that is not answering the question, that doesn't get angry? I mean, I remember vividly, I had a meeting with the chief executive of a Russian company, and they were raising money, and my colleague, who was Russian, said, well, why are you, I said, why are you raising the money? And he said, oh, I want to put some money into my local football club. And my colleague laughed and said, oh, so you're a bit like Abramovich. And the guy jumped up and started shouting, and how dare you compare me to, and when people are genuinely upset, they show it. And that seemed, a normal person would be genuinely upset if you asked them if they were a fraudster. But as a hedge fund analyst, that's not the question you can really ask.
I mean, that's one of the great fun things about being a journalist is you get to ask people very rude questions they kind of have to answer. Because if you're this is one of the things about how the sell side works and analysts generally, is there's very little incentive for an analyst to ask difficult questions, to put out a sell recommendation, because one, no one rewards them for sell recommendations. I remember one of the things, I think, was it Tim Allen, who was an engineering analyst at Citigroup when I was there. I always remember him telling me, he was like, if you ever become an analyst, your first job at a new place, never do a sell recommendation, because no one will thank you for it. Like, if you say buy this and it goes up and you make the money, great, I'll remember that. But if you're going to tell them to sell, and even if you do save them money by doing it, you're kind of having to say they've made the wrong decision in the first place. And no one likes to hear that.
That's an interesting theory as to why there's so few sell recommendations. I always thought that the main reason was to upset the management, and you didn't really want to fall out with your main source of...
Oh yeah, exactly, that's another one as well. Yeah, because they will just not take your questions on conference calls, they won't speak to you. They have the power in that relationship.
So you had this interview with the chief executive, and it didn't go well, and then presumably you wrote up that your suspicions were confirmed. What happened next?
So one of the challenges of trying to write about accounting fraud is, unless you have really solid evidence, you can't use the F word in print, because you'll get sued out of existence. And so it took me a long time to write the first sort of stories. They were called the House of Wirecard series. And they sort of framed Wirecard as this puzzle. Why is it doing these strange things? Why don't its numbers work? And and then like a whole bunch of crazy stuff kind of happens. Some short sellers get involved, and they present this other theory that Wirecard is a big money laundering enterprise because it processes payments, and it was growing faster than everyone else, and was also much more profitable than anyone else. And normally you can do one or the other, right? You can't do both at the same time. That's very challenging.
Well, Adyen?
Okay. But I don't think Adyen has Wirecard's margins. I could be wrong. I haven't checked in a while.
I've
forgotten what Wirecard's margins were. It's about 55%, so pretty close, I think.
Okay. So you can do it, but I think Adyen is probably much more open about how they're doing.
I just for the avoidance of doubt, as the lawyers say, we're not thinking anything wrong with Adyen, other than the share price is still quite high.
And so there were these two competing theories. Is Wirecard a fraud, or is it a money laundering enterprise? And one kind of excused the others. I think some investors looked at it and said, well, maybe it's making these profits in grey areas, and that's the reason it won't talk in detail about where it makes its money and how. And the real breakthrough was this moment in October 2018. So the stories hadn't worked. Wirecard had gone from strength to strength and had just entered the DAX 30 index. And I'm on the train going into work, and I get an email one Monday morning from a whistleblower saying, would you be interested in some dirty doings at a financial company? And it turns out it's Wirecard. And it wasn't the whistleblower who got in touch, it was his mother. So the whistleblower is this lawyer who works in Singapore called Gill. Amazing guy, had this sort of amazing life, but he had been raised by his mother, who she was sort of the victim of an arranged marriage. Turned out her husband was a drunk, she got rid of him, raised Pav by herself, whilst working as a banker, and he became a lawyer. And he was working inside Wirecard's Asian headquarters, discovered the head of the finance team there was cooking books. It's really amateurish frauds, like sort of cutting and pasting the logo of some random company, slapping it onto a Wirecard invoice, and then submitting that for payment by the accounts team. And the numbers were all quite small, like 2 million euros here, 2 million euros there. But when they did an investigation and reported what was going on to Munich, the whole thing got squashed. And suddenly, this guy, Jan Marsalek, is put in charge of it. And the lawyers who were doing it in Singapore are like, hang on a second. We're not sure what Jan's involvement in here is here, but he's definitely a witness to what's going on. At the fringes again. And he gets forced out. But what they did is they basically said to him, well, you can resign, or we're going to fire you. He said, okay, fine, I'll resign. But they didn't march him out the door there and then. They gave him to the end of the week. And so the next morning he goes into work, sticks a little portable hard drive in, and takes a copy of all the documents that they've been doing of their investigation. And that's what it gives to me.
So that's fantastic ammunition for you. I mean, this is the end of 2018.
Yeah.
Why did it take so long for the whole thing to unravel? Because at this point you've got quite good evidence, and then the spotlight must really be on them, because you've effectively got proof that there's at least a small fraud going on, and that the company hasn't really done what they should do about it.
So so we publish, start of 2019, there's fraud in Singapore. Small, but what on earth is going on there? And I also remember there's a great hedge fund manager called Eduardo Marx, who runs Patento. And he did this whole presentation, I think, what was it called? Wirecard, where short sellers go to retire. Because he'd been shorting the company for years and years. And what really wound him up was everyone was focusing on the amounts involved. $30 million in the context of a €2 billion company. He was saying it's the practices. The practices are what matter. Why on earth is the head of their finance team there doing all these stupid little frauds? And why didn't they fire him the second they found out? But the thing that you find with the frauds is it's very hard to convince people when money is at stake, particularly their own money. And if you've been invested in Wirecard for years, you feel like a genius. It's gone from sort of €4 billion market cap when I start looking at it to 25 at its peak, So people didn't want to see it, but also Wirecard did something very effective. It always demonized its critics as being in league with short sellers. And this is where Nick Gold comes in. I think you mentioned him at the beginning, so we should probably explain this slightly mad scenario. So we get into this sort of rhythm where the Financial Times publishes a story, Wirecard says, no, it's not true. And by the way, you're corruptly involved with short sellers. And the German authorities buy that. They start investigating me and my colleague, Stefania Palmer, who worked on the stories with me. And then each time then we go away and do a whole load more work, publish a new story. Wirecard announces it's suing us. Then we do another story. Wirecard announces it's got $1 billion investment from SoftBank, the big Japanese technology conglomerate. And so every time we do a story, we're like, what is it going to take? So we reach this moment where suddenly I sort of have, the light bulb flicks on. And I'm looking at some of the documents which I've got from this pile from PAB in Singapore. And I'm sort of going, hang on a second. I don't think that company was in business. But here it is in the Wirecard books saying it sends in the load of payment processing every month. And I look it up and it was a bank to binary, nasty FX options broker which got shut down by the US government. I'm like, well, hang on, it got shut down there. So how on earth is it still sending Wirecard a load of business? And I start looking at the others. I'm like, hang on a second, it doesn't exist. Out of business. So I start to realise this is the big lie. They're literally just making it up. The customers are fake. The profits are fake, the sales are fake. And so this is, I think, the moment of triumph. We've got them. So we go to Wirecard for questions to ask them about it. That's how it works as a journalist. You can't just publish, you have to ask people first. Get their response. And they come back with this tape, or they talk about this tape. And what you have is this guy called Nick Gold, who is he's a sort of just a big bundle of charisma. He runs a nightclub called The Box in Soho, and he's sort of surrounded by beautiful women. He's one of those guys who is immediately the life and soul of the party. Self-deprecating jokes, he'd hang out at the Chiltern Firehouse in London, and he'd be jumping over the bar to make drinks for everyone, jumping back over. People would be stopping by. He's that guy. And so he has this meeting in his office near the Chiltern Firehouse, where in walks a Premiership football agent with this guy who is supposedly a representative of Far Eastern money. And Gold has been primed. He's like, you need to give this guy a good trading idea, and then and then what they'll do is they'll trade together and they'll split the profits. And it's basically that he wants these Far East guys to do the trading with their money and then send him the cut of the profits. And what he says they should do is sell Wirecard, because he's heard there's a new Financial Times story coming. And that sounds quite bad, right? And it did sound bad. And at this moment of, this is it, we've got them, they come up with this tape, and it's like, slam the brakes on. They leak it to the German press. There's all these lurid stories saying Financial Times in league with speculators. And so instead of publishing, suddenly the FT announces that it's investigating me and my editor, Paul Murphy.
And what was Nick Gold's connection to all this? Was he paid by Wirecard, or do you know? Have you spoken to him? Have you asked him?
So I've asked Nick about this, and what you have to understand is there is this sort of strata of finance in London and elsewhere that Paul Murphy calls the bandits. And that should be understood as a sort of a term of endearment rather than pejorative. Because, I tell the story in the book how we got to know these guys. He was, so Paul Murphy is this sort of very old school reporter. He's been doing it for, at least since the 90s. And he was working for the Sunday Business, funded by the Barclay brothers. And he quits to go back to The Guardian as finance editor, but his boss, Jeff Randolph, says, I know you've got this story. I want you to get it. And what had happened is this broker had gone bust, and this roly-poly banker had sort of waddled up to him and handed over 2 carrier bags full of documents. And what it exposed was this insider trading ring in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically blamed this somehow for the broker going bust. So Paul gets on a jet to Monaco at the Barclay brothers' expense and spends 2 weeks wining and dining all of these guys, gets to know the whole bandit scene. And they're mainly sort of, retired businessmen, people with money who basically love trading, sharing gossip, maybe takeover gossip, that sort of thing. And he gets back and he writes the whole story, complete with, carrier bags of cash changing hands at borders, all the people involved. And he hands it in, and the lawyers go, ah! There is no way you can publish any of this. And so what he ultimately does, to cut a long story short, is he's like, well, he can't expose these guys, he'll turn them into sources. And so he sort of knew a whole bunch of these guys in this world, and that's where Nick Gold comes from, rich businessman. I mean, so he's a nightclub owner, but I think he also had quite a substantial stationery business. But who wants to talk about that? And so and it's all these guys who they trade together, they share tips, and it's it's not like deep thought out investment. It's like, oh, what's right? Okay, that's a good idea. Get on your phone, make the trade, and it's all spread betting because it's tax free.
And you would have thought that high activity shorting Wirecard would have been sufficient to put pressure on the share price and undermine people's confidence. The company managed to skate over all of this. I mean, you have to admire, in a slightly perverse way, how well they executed all this. It makes me just wonder, these are obviously very smart people. I mean, why didn't they just make money legitimately?
I mean, there was a diabolical genius to it, wasn't there? And again, come back to this character Marsalek and Braun. So Braun, I think, really wanted to be chief executive of the company. And he had this prestigious position, but he was kind of a figurehead. Like the trainer guy and pornographer put him in place because he didn't want to be the face of a public company. I mean, there's barely a photo of him that you can find online. And so Braun was, he even talked about it, people tell me, he saw himself sort of more as a chairman than, a chief executive. And, one guy in the book, he talked to me about, the conversations he'd have with Braun. And he would change the subject if you started to talk about some of the racier parts of processing. So I'm not really convinced that he could have run a proper, effective payment processing operation. And then you have this other kid, Jan Marsalek, who is 10 years younger, and he's basically my age. I'm sort of mid-40s, so when he became COO, he was 30. And charmer, knows technology, really smart, but at the same time, no formal qualifications. He didn't even finish high school, let alone a degree. He always said he was too busy. Can't drive, again, too busy. And he couldn't really work anywhere else. He was sort of stuck with Wirecard, but he didn't really have the experience. And so you get this picture of him, like, they referred to him internally as sort of Wirecard's chaotic genius.
Right.
And so he was chief operating officer, but he had no staff, which is weird, right?
Yes.
And no team. He would just fly around the world, constantly doing deals, sort of everywhere and nowhere, not really accountable to anyone. So I kind of think Wirecard did have a real processing business, but it was losing money for a very long time. And you can run quite a large business for a long time if it doesn't matter if you lose money, right? And, so there probably was a moment when Wirecard could have continued as a legitimate business, but it would have had to stop growing.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the thing.
So how did it all unravel in the end?
I mean, so two things go over really. One is we published a story in the Financial Times in October 2019, which basically said, this is how the fraud is being committed. These are the fake companies. Here are all the documents which show what's going on. And, I'm very proud of that. It's like, here is the evidence of what is happening. This is a fraud. And that, in a sense, killed the company. It was,
And it took you how long to write that article?
Oh, I mean, so I had that moment of revelation in May, and it was 6 months, although, we were delayed for 3 months by the internal investigation.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say, it was 3 months of, just trying to work out, okay, which company could it possibly be? Ringing every company, trying to get an answer, because I'm trying to talk to them about, have you ever worked with Wirecard? No. Why are you asking me about Wirecard? So just all of that thing to get the answers, to build it, then to try and write it, make it understandable. And Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT, he was quite angry by this point. And he'd been with us every step of the way, and so had the lawyer. So it was this sort of team of the four of us who were really very closely involved in every story. And he had said to us, which is unusual for a newspaper, but he was like, I want us to draw blood this time. I want an exocet. And that's what we were trying to do. And so, from that moment on, it was Wile E. Coyote. It had gone off the cliff, and its legs were spinning, and it was just, when's it going to plunge? But it stayed like that for 8 months. This is the thing that still astonishes me. I was convinced we printed enough evidence for, the police knock on the door and start making their inquiries. But companies get to investigate themselves. I don't think there's another area of life where this happens. Wirecard appointed KPMG to come and conduct a special audit. Take 6 months, they do all of that. And KPMG says, we couldn't find any evidence that all these sales you're claiming are real. Wirecard flips that on its head and says, KPMG didn't find any evidence that there was fraud. It sounds crazy when you say it like that, but that's what they were working with. And so everything boils down to the audit. Ernst & Young have signed off on Wirecard's accounts every year for a decade. Will they sign off again? Because if they do, that's a big wet blanket over the whole thing. Even if it's a qualified audit, maybe Wirecard can make its way through, and so will they sign? And what it comes down to is 2 pieces of paper. And I mean, this is one of the most farcical sections in the whole book, where how they come to get these 2 pieces of paper, which involves sort of going to the office of a Manila divorce lawyer who's a YouTuber. He's got one of those plaques for like 100,000 subscribers on his wall. And he's the guy that Wirecard says is in charge of accounts which hold 1.9 billion euros of Wirecard, the European financial institutions, cash. And it's in these special accounts at 2 Philippine banks. And so there's a whole bunch of people involved. Auditors from EY, KPMG, Wirecard lawyers, and they get in this convoy of cars, which the divorce lawyer has arranged for police motorcycle outriders to help them cut through the traffic in Manila in the Philippines. And they go to the first branch, and they don't go to the headquarters. They go to this tiny branch on a little road with like a bicycle shop and garages and things like that on it, and go into this tiny branch where they all crowd in, and there's basically just enough room for them and the staff. And one of them jumps up and is like, "Hello, yes." I'm like, "Hi, we're here about Wirecard." He looks blank. And then, the divorce lawyer looks at him and says, "Yes, Wirecard." And he's like, "Ah, yes, Wirecard." And he produces this envelope. And then they repeat a whole other thing. But these envelopes are basically 2 pieces of paper which show Wirecard's accounts have 1.9 billion euros in them. And that's all the evidence that EY has that this money exists. And this is in March 2020. And as the months progress, EY is starting to get a little bit nervous about this, what with everything else going on. And they're trying to ask the bank to separately confirm it. And they're asking Wirecard, can they actually transfer some of this money to Germany? And Wirecard, Marcus Brown keeps saying, yes, no, the money's definitely on its way, it'll come soon. But nothing happens. And so eventually, someone senior at EY has to get in touch with the chief executive of each bank directly and say, what's going on? And these 2 letters come back. And what the letters say is, these accounts are spurious. And what happens in Germany is everyone has to Google the word spurious because it's quite an obscure English word. And then all hell breaks loose.
The book is astonishing because, as I said earlier, it is stranger than fiction, right?
It's mad, isn't it?
And in fact, many of these stories, the visit to the bank in Manila, the remote branch, reminded me of a story about a Chinese fraud where they did exactly the same thing, where they took the fund manager to the branch, and they showed him on the computer in the branch, the hundreds of millions in the account, and he went away very satisfied, all ready to buy the shares, and they were 40 minutes away in the car, and then he realized he'd left his coat in the bank, and so they told the driver to turn around and went back to the branch, and they were disassembling it. And of course, these, when you're doing multi-100 million or billion fraud, then you can deploy a lot of resources in order to cover it up. But the book's amazing. Normally I ask people to recommend a book, and I'm not going to do that because it's obvious which book we should recommend. I just wonder now, you've done this. What do you do next?
Oh, the next story. I'm sure someone out there has something that they think should be in the public, some skullduggery or wrongdoing, and hopefully they'll get in touch.
Because it's my theory that there's a huge amount of skullduggery going on and has been going on for the last several years. Most of it is honest companies flattering their earnings in order to make their bonuses for their CEOs and CFOs. But sometimes, once you've done that for a while, this is a kind of the Enron thing. So once you've made up a bit of revenue, the following year you've got to do a bit more, and that's often how these frauds develop. So, do you think you're going to be pretty busy in the next few years?
I think there's some pretty big frauds out there. Money's been free for a decade. And we've also had this weird market. Wirecard exploited this very effectively, where they sort of sprinkled technology over everything as a sort of fairy dust. Our business uses technology. It's like, oh, well, it's clearly worth 10 times what a normal business is worth. And, at the same time, you've had people like SoftBank just spraying money around. And so I think we're going to find a lot of corporate frauds like that. A lot of people have just been juicing the numbers because no one's really checking. Nobody ever checks. And then we also just have crypto, which is, it boggles my mind that, we talk all about Wirecard, which is, people lost 20 billion euros, something in that region. But then you have crypto frauds happening all the time. And people having normal conversations where they describe a Ponzi scheme business model as if that's normal and fine. And so, I'm a long-standing crypto skeptic. I was saying Bitcoin would go to nothing when it was like $1,000. So clearly I know nothing. But I remain of the view that at some point we will look back on the crypto madness as this sort of collective mania.
It's interesting. I mean, I think crypto is quite a weird sort of area. I've been trying to learn about it, and I've been watching it, and I think when I can see where Bitcoin is going, and when it gets to my target, I think I might start to look at it quite seriously. I don't know.
This is the danger, Steve. You see this time and again with crypto. What happens is people invest mental energy and effort in learning about it because it is genuinely fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what they do is they mistake that interest and the fascinating bits of the mechanics for some sort of financial rationale for the whole thing. And there just isn't. All of these crypto schemes are hammers looking for nails, and there are no nails. And never mind the fact, by the way, that if you're buying Bitcoin, then you're engaged in some sort of horrendous anti-environment global warming project due to the absurd amounts of energy involved. So crypto has successfully rebranded itself from a currency to an asset. And sure, there are enough people around who are sticking a bit of money into crypto because why not? And that's going to last quite a long time. But it's sort of like the NFT stuff is the canary in the coal mine.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a hilarious, Matt Levine has been hilarious about the Bored Ape movement, and I kind of get all that. One thing you mentioned, SoftBank. I mean, SoftBank was pretty heavily involved here. It was pretty heavily involved in Greensill. Have you spent any time thinking about what else they're involved in?
SoftBank's a fascinating company, isn't it?
No, it really is.
And, Masa Son, who runs it, really got into trouble in the first dot-com boom, but was basically bailed out because he made a couple of incredibly, once-in-a-lifetime bets.
Visionary, I think is the word you're looking for.
Lucky,
yeah.
Like Alibaba. And that bails out an awful lot of bad stuff.
Yeah.
What I think the problem is premising $100 billion of investment funds on that strategy. And I think with SoftBank, what we see is a result of that.
It's quite funny. Your former home, the Lex column, suggested that what they should do is buy back their stock, which I was got quite a lot of debt. I thought, well, they've obviously been listening to the wrong source. I thought it was hilarious. But I've been fascinated by SoftBank. I saw Masa Son speak for the first time in 2016, and he spoke at the Goldman Sachs at an amazing macro conference with Howard Marks, Mike Bloomberg, and Masa. And when he spoke, he said, "Oh yeah, I gave Steve Jobs the idea for the iPhone." He didn't quite say that, but that was and it's bizarre. It's been absolutely bizarre. So it's interesting that he was involved in Wirecard and that he was involved in Greensill, and we'll see what else he's been involved in. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And the book is amazing. Well done.
Oh, thank you so much. It is, I think, hopefully out now. And thank you for having me on to talk about it. It's been great fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Clapham, and that was the Behind the Balance Sheet podcast. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whichever platform you use. And don't forget to sign up on our website, behindthebalancesheet.com, to get our newsletter and access to our club where we post free training, podcast commentary, and much more. Thanks for joining us.